Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Hessling, editor of the Midland Daily News. Thank you all so much for coming today to talk about two Michigan public acts that are crucial to our community and to a thriving democracy. Michigan's Freedom of Information and Open Meetings Acts are not just important for the press, but for all citizens. We are extremely thankful to the Michigan Press Association for facilitating today's forum and to Attorney General Dana Nessel for taking the time to come to Midland to discuss these very important laws. We hope you leave here with a greater understanding of your rights in terms of getting information from your local units of government. Again, thank you all for coming.
Hi, how's everybody? Thank you. You guys. What an amazing, warm Midland welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. So I want to start off by thanking Kate for organizing today's seminar and congratulating you again on your new role as the editor of the Midland Daily Press. Congratulations. And of course, as always, I want to thank Lisa McGraw of the Michigan Press Association for your where are you, Lisa? Oh, there she is. Thank you, Lisa, for your continued partnership and helping to reestablish these very important seminars. And, you know, I think we all agree these are important topics, not only to your members, but to my office and to the general public as well. And so I'd like to also introduce you all to my office's FOIA and OMA guru, Tom Quasarano. Tom knows more about these laws, I think, than anyone else in the state of Michigan. He has worked for the Department of Attorney General since the 1920s, did you say? Yeah, apparently? No, for how long?
I was born at a very young age.
Yeah. He looks great, though, doesn't he? What? No, really, wait, how long have you worked at the AG's office?
32 years.
32 years, my God. Is that a great, dedicated public servant or what? Okay. So I have to say I'm very excited to be in a room full of local officials, elected and otherwise. Do we have any local officials who are here today? If you could stand up and just be recognized. Hi. Is that J.G. Brooks back there? Midland prosecutor. Fantastic. Thanks for being here. And thanks to everybody for being here. So anyway, I'm excited to be able to talk about the Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act because these are two of the tools reporters and the public use to keep us honest and to keep us on our toes. And I know that we have a number of fact seekers and fact checkers here, the journalists who are committed to finding out what's going on behind closed doors, no matter where those doors are located, and then opening them up for the rest of us. And I know that these FOIA sessions were started in tandem with the Michigan Press Association back under Michigan Attorney General Frank Kelly, who I know many of you in the audience remember, still the longest serving state attorney general in American history. And so he did these. I know that Attorney General Jennifer Granholm continued those and Mike Cox, but they sort of fell by the wayside in recent years. And so it's been, not going to say why, but we're in Midland. So, but I was excited to restart the tradition and to reignite these seminars and to renew our partnership between our office and the Michigan Press Association. And this is the fourth one of these? Yep, it's dark, but it looks like four. I think the fourth one, and then we had a special event in Detroit over the weekend that we also did. But, you know, it's my belief, I'm sure it's the belief of most of you, or if not all of you, I would say, if you're here today, that elected officials and government entities, you know, we're constantly receiving requests for information, and we should, right? The media is the public's watchdog, and we are always under the microscope. We serve the people, and they deserve to know what we're doing and how we're doing it. And unlike some others in elected office, I do not subscribe to the belief that the media is the enemy of the people. I believe the media is an essential tool for keeping us a democracy. And I am deeply ashamed and deeply embarrassed that Michigan is one of only 2 states. I thought it was the only state. Just recently learned, also Louisiana. So we're not by ourselves at the very bottom, but we are the only 2 states in the nation that exempt from FOIA the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the legislature from the requirements of the state's Freedom of Information Act. And not only that, but we're one of only 8 states that net a failing grade from the Center for Public Integrity. And we are, make no mistake about it, we are failing here in Michigan. And then to add a little insult to injury, there are Attorney General opinions that have been authored, not mine, that opine that the Michigan legislature is exempt. And then not to be left out, the Michigan Supreme Court also exempted itself from FOIA requirements. So, yeah, so I'm like, why am I subject to this and like no one else? It should be everybody, right? It's only fair. But when our government keeps its residents from knowing what happens behind closed doors, that is, as we all know, when democracies die. And without these constructs, without FOIA and OMA, I honestly, I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but I just feel like that's the end of the America that we know and love when we don't know what our government is doing behind closed doors. And I find that to be unacceptable, and I don't believe in withholding important information from the public, and I don't think it should be the norm. And so I feel compelled to point out that at the state level, not only are we not opening doors, but we're closing them, we're locking them with deadbolts, then we're nailing boards across them, and then we're building a moat around that, and then there's maybe like electric eels in the moat, and then those giant walkers from Game of Thrones, what are those called? They're on the other side. I mean, that's, we're making it impossible for our public to know what's happening in this state. And those of you out there who are elected officials, not you guys, you absolutely are totally FOIA-able, again, as am I, unless it falls under attorney-client privilege or some of the other few exemptions. But let me say this and let me be clear about it. I am a big fan of government transparency. And already this year, my office has received 423 FOIA requests, 77 from journalists. The vast majority of them are from members of the public. And that commitment to transparency is why I am here today, because I believe in it, and I also believe in promoting it. And so do many others, but unfortunately, at this point, not enough. So in the last legislative session here in Michigan, there were efforts to establish a 9-member open government commission, which would be subject to both FOIA and the Open Meetings Act, and that would receive and respond to citizens' complaints in regard to public bodies' responses to FOIA requests, and that could issue binding opinions overturning a public body's assertion of an exemption, exclusion, or privilege in response to a FOIA request if it was deemed appropriate. And so that seems like a great idea, right? But of course it failed. There was also a 10-bill bipartisan, and let me say that again, bipartisan, proposal to create the Legislative Open Records Act. And that would bring the legislature under FOIA, and it would strike the exemption from FOIA for the governor and lieutenant governor and the executive office employees. Also, another great idea, right? Guess what happened to that? Yeah, that went nowhere too. There was an effort to require, under the Open Meetings Act, that board and commission members, with limited exceptions, be physically present at public meetings in order to vote, which doesn't sound like a novel idea, especially, but still no success on that. And then there was a renewed interest in the legislature earlier on this year, and during Sunshine Week, bills were introduced to open up and bring sunshine to the executive office of the governor, as well as to the legislature. And I'm happy to say those bills passed in the State House, 107-0 vote on March 19th. And they've been stuck in the Senate Oversight Committee ever since. So then, just last month, there was a little bit more progress, and I use that term very loosely. A bipartisan transparency legislative package was passed by the House Elections Committee and then referred to the House Committee on Ways and Means, where it sits waiting for a hearing. But those bills would require financial disclosure by candidates and elected officials, myself included, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the Secretary of State, the state Supreme Court, State Court of Appeals, and the State House and Senate. And by the way, so we're not required, I should say, to display our tax returns, but I know a number of us in the state executive offices were asked to do that. And so we did. And so under the governor, she published hers, and the Secretary of State published hers, and I did the same. And the only comment I got is, wow, why don't you make more money than that? Those were the real comments. Like, if you're such a good lawyer, shouldn't you make more money? I was like, there's really no winning with you guys, is there? But anyway, but it's not required. It's not required that we do that. And, I just think that we all should subscribe to the notion that a government accountable to the people is really at the core of the United States Constitution, right? Isn't that what we all learned? And in Michigan, in accordance with the Constitution, all political power is inherent in the people. So in other words, open and transparent government is part of the law of the land, or at least it should be. Freedom of Information Act and its counterpart, the Open Meetings Act, are there to promote and safeguard the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to petition our government. And when this all took effect, back in 1977, FOIA was supposed to provide a means for the people to be properly informed about their government, its officials and employees, so they could fully and actively participate in the democratic process. And that means that government has an obligation and a responsibility to meet the spirit and also the intent of the law, ideally without putting people through the unnecessary hoops, to get information that they want and that they need. And so one of Governor Whitmer's first executive directives banned the use of private email to conduct state business within the executive branch. And then at the Michigan Press Association's annual meeting, she signed an executive directive that ensures extensions in response to FOIA requests should be the exception, not the rule. And she went even so far as to require each state department to have a FOIA liaison who then works in tandem with a FOIA coordinator to ensure that there would be prompt responses to FOIA requests. And she went even a little bit further than that, and when she called on, at her State of the State address, she called on the legislature to open up her office and the legislature to FOIA. So it feels like maybe progress, but, not really. It's great. It sounds like we're moving forward and that not all is lost, because there's definitely a renewed interest, at least, in transparency among many statewide elected leaders. And I have great hope that at some point, I hope soon, they'll actually bring sunshine to every elected office in this state as well as the legislature. And I remain encouraged. I'm encouraged by Governor Whitmer's steadfast commitment to ensuring open, accessible, and transparent government. And, my office absolutely shares in that commitment. So let's get a little bit into the weeds of these very important parts of our democratic process, FOIA and OMA. Are we still having technical difficulties? Okay. Well, I'm sorry. We usually have the most amazing PowerPoint you've ever seen. Yeah, well, it's better than a wardrobe malfunction, I guess. But I will fortunately has not been an issue for me. But just to start with the basics, we can go over this. A FOIA request, as I'm sure everybody here knows, can be submitted by anyone. And in our office, we get requests from reporters, obviously on a frequent basis, but we also get requests from individuals and attorneys and out-of-state groups. And some of them have names like Treasure Ireland, and another one of our frequent flyers is Kit D. Litter. But we can't and we won't discriminate against any request. We consider all requests to be legitimate, even if they kind of seem like a fishing expedition. We still honor each and every request. And we may not always have what people are asking for, but we are obligated to look to see if we do. So just the basics, what is a FOIA request? Well, it's a written request that describes a public record sufficiently to enable the public body to find that public record. And breaking it down a little bit further, here are the steps to such a request. Well, a person asks to inspect, copy, or receive a copy of a public record by making a written request for the record to the FOIA coordinator of the public body. And a written request can be via email, can be via letter, can be through fax, but for some reason I don't really understand, it must include a physical address. So you do have to have a physical address on your request. The FOIA is then considered received 1 business day after the receipt of an electronic transmission. And let's see, when it's sent in the U.S. mail, it's considered to be sent the following day, to be received the following day. That's right, isn't it? Okay, just checking. So from there, the FOIA coordinator will determine whether or not the information is available. And if it is available, they have to process that request. And if not, a letter of denial is sent, which is sometimes a little confusing to the recipient, because if it's not read carefully, sometimes it looks as though they're just denying the request because they don't want to provide the information when, in fact, by statute, it can say deny if the information just isn't available or doesn't exist. But fulfilling the request doesn't always go without questions or concern, as I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with. So getting a little bit deeper into FOIA, there are 3 questions that top our list from constituents and also from members of the media. Now, the first is this: cost. That's addressed by Section 4 of the FOIA statute, which addresses limitations on the total fees that anybody is allowed to charge. Now, this section allows for fees to be charged for obtaining a FOIA request. It is not designed to price a member of the public or the media out of being able to obtain the information that they rightly should have access to. But keep in mind that we provide existing documents. We don't create documents. And just, I'll give you an example because this just happened in our office a few weeks ago. We had a reporter that asked us to provide not just a list of all of our active cases, but also wanted a description of what all those cases were. So they wanted us to create a document where we described it, and then further asked for an analysis of the exposure that the state had on each one of those. And basically, how much is this case worth? And that's what discovery's for. That's what a trial is for. You know, a plaintiff's attorney might think a case is worth $15 million. The state might think it's worth $0. So there are things like that. Like, we don't have a document that would say some of those things, so we can't provide that document. Can we provide a list of the cases? Of course we can do that. But we don't make up new documents just for the purposes of answering questions. That's not officially, that is, FOIA would not require you to do that. And if it did, it would be incredibly time consuming for an office like mine that handles about 40,000 cases at a time. So fees may sometimes be charged for things like copying of public records for inspection, for mailing, and for duplication and labor costs. And I can tell you from experience, you know, it's funny, I filed a lot of FOIA requests as a private attorney, and I know the frustration of feeling like you have a public body or a department that's not really being responsive. But now that I'm on the other side of that, I see, you know, for my staff, how hard they work to comply with these requests, but just sometimes how time-consuming it turns out to be. So one of the things that we try to do is, when it comes to our partners in the media, if a reporter contacts us and asks for something, and it's sort of stated broadly, and it would take a long time for us to compile that, sometimes, you know, our public information office, our communications people will just say, can you narrow it down for me, and just sort of ask some questions of the reporter to see if we can find that information a little bit quicker, if we know better what they're asking for. And, you know, we try to do that. And sometimes it really just takes a phone call to do that. And so I'm happy to report to date, our office has actually processed 362 of those requests without any fee at all whatsoever. So while we're on the topic, though, of costs, it's worth noting that a public body cannot charge fees unless it specifically identifies the nature of the cost required to comply with the request. And so some of you out here have received a notice of cost, which then includes an itemized list of what those costs are. And here's a little bit more information for you. If the public body does not respond on time, then that fee is reduced by 5% per day, with a maximum reduction of 50% if the late response was willful and intentional. So there's a little bit of information. What I'd like to do at this point is to take a little bit of a break for questions on things that we've covered up until this point. And Courtney, do we have a microphone out there? How are we going to do this?
They only have one mic. Only that one.
Oh, only this one? Yeah. All right, well, I mean, if anybody has any questions, just go ahead and stand up, and Tom and I will do our best to answer you. So just anything on the stuff that we've covered. We do have a lot of other areas we're going to cover, so just if it's on costs or format of the FOIA or any questions like that. You want to go ahead, sir?
What is the threshold, or how do you determine when you're being overcharged for a FOIA? Because it's records they should have on their computer that all they've got to get, all they have to do is print it out or put it into an electronic format.
Right. Well, let me start by saying, when you say all it is that they have to do is print it out, and I'm just going to talk about my office, and Tom can answer that more generally, but let me say this. One of the things that we'll get into, for instance, are the different exemptions. So in my office, for instance, we're like the state's biggest law firm. So we have a lot of clients that we represent. They're state agencies, they are state employees, or sometimes, of course, we are the plaintiff in a lot of cases too. I've been suing a lot of people lately, I'm going to be honest with you. There have been a lot of lawsuits filed. So let me give you an example, okay? So let's say that I sued earlier on in the year about 19 pharmaceutical companies for colluding with each other to fraudulently inflate the price of generic medication. Thank you. But let's say, I mean, if you had any of those companies or their employees decided to FOIA us, well, there's attorney-client privilege in there, but there's also work product, because we're discussing how we're deliberating how to proceed on the case. So in our office, someone actually has to go through each one of the emails, review the email, and see if it fits within an exemption. And because we're a law firm, many times it does. So that is time intensive, especially if you have thousands and thousands of emails and each one of them has to be individually reviewed. So I know it seems like, gosh, all you have to do is print this stuff out. I know at my office that turns out not to be the case. But Tom, do you want to answer that though? Obviously we're a little different at the Department of Attorney General, and there are a lot of public bodies that don't have the same exemptions that we have.
When it comes to fees, the statute's very clear that a public body cannot charge a fee to do any of the labor tasks that are mentioned in the statute unless the public body states clearly that failure to charge would result in an unreasonably high cost to the public body as to that specific FOIA request. And that has to be spelled out in the fee form that the Attorney General referred to. That fee form has to give the hourly rate of the lowest paid public body employee capable to search for and retrieve records, to examine, review, to set forth the exemption in great detail how it applies in that particular instance. Also, the public body is required to have published FOIA policies, procedures, and guidelines, and without those, the public body cannot charge dime one. So that is something that has to be looked into to determine that they've met all these preliminary statutory requirements. The statute was amended to allow citizens to sue over fee disputes, which was not in the statute originally. In a fee dispute, you would allege that the public body's fee either does not comply with everything that the Attorney General mentioned in Section 4, or otherwise does not comply with the published procedures and guidelines. So in doing that, the person who is seeking the remedy of the court and chooses to hire an attorney fees also would be included as a recovery cost to the citizen, including the filing fee for the court complaint, disbursements, costs, all of that. So if you're saying that this should be readily available, then either you would appeal the fee determination before court, at your option, to the head of the public body asking for a second review, a second set of eyes. Many people thought that that review process would be a rubber stamp merely. I find that it's not. That review process by the head of a public body, be it the chair of the commission, the school board president, the mayor's office appointing someone to act as the head of that city as a public body, that review process is very important. An opportunity to see whether the fee is in fact more than it should be. Also, the statute says that any records requested under a FOIA request that are on the public body's website shall be offered to the citizen requester by giving the link to that exact web page where that information is, and that the public body is encouraged to put more and more of its public records on the website so that the citizen requester can simply access the information on the website. So there's a lot of stopgap measures in there. There's a lot of provisions to promote what we're talking about. Request at little or no cost, if at all possible. You have your hand up again.
Yeah, continuation. Can a FOIA officer for a township try and talk you out of requesting certain information?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen in your case. Because I find you to be quite informed about it. If that were the situation, does the statute anticipate that? Of course not. Does any common sense anticipate that? No, I don't think so. So the fact of the matter is that if somebody is just delaying the FOIA processing, that could be construed under the statute as a denial. I would appeal that to the head of the public body explaining why you're appealing that. But there's nothing that prevents a FOIA coordinator from conversing by telephone or in person with a FOIA requester to see whether the two parties can find a way to, as the Attorney General mentioned, refine the request. Because many times a citizen has no idea what the public body has in terms of the volume of records. I've been with the state 32 years, and I'm still amazed about the amount of records being produced at this very moment. It's in the billions of bits of information, if you will. So again, it's not meant to be an adversarial relationship. FOIA coordinators are gatekeepers of the First Amendment. It's a time-honored position in my personal opinion. So they should be working with citizens to advance the citizens' interest in those records. But are we going to find that some players don't play by those rules? Unfortunately, probably so. I want to know where you found that microphone, by the way. Okay.
It's called command voice.
Command voice. Very good. Thank you.
Retired First Sergeant.
Thank you, First Sergeant. Thank you for your service.
Okay, in the interest of transparency, now, a few minutes ago, you might have heard me say that we had the best PowerPoint ever. That may have been a bit of an exaggeration. I'm just gonna, this is actually our PowerPoint. So, anyway, so any more in terms of costs or any things we talked about? Sir, do you have a question?
Yes, my name is Greg Ebo, I'm a Midland resident. Last year, the legislature, they eventually passed a statute, but the original statute contained an exemption from for agricultural water withdrawals, that the hydrology information would be exempted from FOIA. I don't believe it made it into the final version of the law, but it was actually tightening up freedom of information in that statute. And I wondered, is there a constitutional issue there justifying that language on that terrorists might find the information helpful? Is there a constitutional issue there that your office might want to tackle?
That's really interesting. That wasn't in any way, shape, or form in regard to, what's that?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. That sounds like something Nestle might have put into the bill, but I don't know that. Okay. But what about that time, though? I mean, if you have, as part of the legislation, something that says, well, you know, anything that the public seeks to discover cannot be in accordance with this particular piece of legislation. I mean, that's a way of circumventing the intent of FOIA. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Yeah. Come on over. Got one microphone. We'll share it.
Well, one thing to point out is that in the section dealing with the laundry list of exemptions, they're permissive, not mandatory. The only time you'd have a mandatory non-disclosure under FOIA is if another statute supersedes FOIA. HIPAA, for example, the Family Educational Rights Privacy Act about student records, for example. So that's common sense. But the cybersecurity provisions that were added recently speak for themselves. For lack of a better expression, the Homeland Security exemption that came in months after 9/11. The story behind that was the Michigan Department of Transportation was asked under a FOIA request for the thickness of the concrete underpad of the Mackinac Bridge with no designation about who the requester was. A little bit of a panic set in. They did some checking and found out it was a electrical contracting subcontractor for an engineer doing work. So it's a bona fide request. But there was nothing in the statute at the time to protect that kind of information from going out to the world at large, because where does the information go out once it's released under FOIA? To the whole world, not just to the requester. So with that said, there is a new exemption that speaks to the public's right to access that information, but based on the public body's ability to say, in this particular instance, we're not going to disclose this for that reason. But these are all based on hurdles that the public body must clear before it can decide to not disclose that information. So it's a pro-disclosure statute. Any exemption taken can be appealed to the head of the public body. From there, if need be, can be appealed to the circuit court or court of claims if it's a state public body. So the last word isn't in when a FOIA coordinator says, we can't give that information out because of this, that, or the other thing. Again, it all must be explained in that written notice initially issued to the FOIA requester. Does that address it?
I think what this gentleman is asking, though, and I'm curious as well, when you have something that is written into a statute specifically that seemingly circumvents the intent and the spirit of FOIA. You know, I mean, generally speaking, obviously, if this was constitutional in nature, then you'd be able to say, well, this violates the Constitution, and a statute, if it violates the Constitution, can be stricken. But if it's actually in a statute, and these are statutes that are in the books, what would one do in that scenario?
Well, again, if it is unconstitutional on its face, that would be something that would be immediately litigated. In terms of these permissive exemptions, You have to read each of the exemptions to see what the legislature intended to accomplish in a particular instance. This is not across the board. This is not a complete shutdown to records that might be important to Homeland Security. It's not saying those records are not subject to disclosure universally. They're saying in a particular instance, the public body must demonstrate that these records should be withheld at this time. Everything is very precise. It's not across the board. And so as a requester, if you do not agree that these records should be withheld in this particular instance, then you have appeal rights to go forward, ultimately with the court if necessary. Anything unconstitutional on its face would be something I'm sure our office would be interested in and to look at. But again, remember, these are permissive exemptions with hurdles to be cleared, not by the requester, but by the public body. Okay, does that help at all? Okay, thank you.
Let's do this. I'm gonna move on, and we're gonna still continue to take questions, but I'm gonna move on to the next portion of this. And that is the second most common question that we receive, and that relates to time. And that's Section 5 of the FOIA statute, and which addresses responses and also extensions. So once a FOIA request has been received, it must be responded to within 5 days, or we have to indicate that we're taking the extension. And these are business days, so you know they're business days and not calendar days, which sometimes confuses people. So for instance, if it's on a holiday or a Saturday or Sunday, then that would not count towards the 5 days. Extensions, though, as our governor has indicated, they should be the exception, not the norm. And asking for them should be out of necessity, not just in an effort to delay the process. And so it's my great hope that with the establishment of these FOIA liaisons through the governor's executive directive earlier this year, that we are having the ability to better streamline these processes more effectively, and to get people the responses that in a more timely basis. So, this is something obviously we're supposed to do, and it's not a favor to the media, it's not a favor to the public, because as I've indicated several times, the public has a right to know how its government is operating, but there really are legitimate instances where these extensions are necessary. And, as I've indicated before, we have so many hard workers at my office, really dedicated public servants, and I know they take this so seriously, and they consider this. This is part of their job to them. And so, I'm proud to say that out of these, 477 plus FOIA requests that we received, we've only asked for extensions on 39 of those so far. But here are some facts on extensions. And if I could just say this too, we have 27 divisions in our office, so sometimes what takes a lot of time is just figuring out who in our office would even have that information. So that in itself is time consuming. The other thing is, our attorneys understand that this is part of their job, is to look for information requested in FOIAs, but it also takes time away from their other work handling the 40,000 some cases of our office. But we do take it very seriously, and we try to do everything we can to not have to ask for an extension. But if we do, then, unless it's all FOIA requests, as I said, have to be responded to within 5 business days after receipt, unless that 10-day extension is taken. And so, of course, that makes it a total of 15 days. And to respond, one of the following has to be done. You either have to grant the request, you have to issue a written notice denying the request, you have to issue a written notice granting the request in part and denying the request in part, or issue a notice requesting an additional 10 business days in which to respond to the request. And so there's a number of reasons for those extensions. Again, sometimes it takes a really long time just to find them. But that's really the most common reason, is that you are doing everything you can to look for them, so that you can know whether the information is actually there or not. And I can't even tell you how many, as Tom said, billions of documents that are there and have to be sometimes searched for. So sometimes it is a bit time consuming, but again, we try to do everything we possibly can not to have to ask for one of these extensions. So anyway, in terms of either time or something else that we already covered, does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, sir.
Well, something that's been alluded to, at least partially, is my concern is bringing this up to 21st century standards. This seems to be addressing 1950 standards of storage of records, whereas in the way I look at it, many documents, when you're creating the document and storing the document, all of these decisions should be made in advance, and so that the retrieval can be automatic. It shouldn't require an attorney to look at this report and look at those hurdles. It seems that all of that should be defined in advance at the time of the creation of the document.
Well, sometimes we do that. Sometimes it'll actually say on the top of any emails that are sent back and forth between our attorneys, it'll say confidential work product. So sometimes we do that. But there are other times where you're corresponding back and forth during the course of the day. I know that I get hundreds of emails every day. And, all of those have to be reviewed still to ensure that we're properly complying with FOIA. And that, again, none of these exemptions apply. You could understand, just for instance, going back to my office, if you hired a lawyer and you had back and forth conversations, attorney-client conversations with your lawyer, you, of course, would want to ensure that those were not all made public while your case was still pending, right? So you can understand that that's an important exception that we have in order to properly represent the state. And we do need to make sure that we're not putting stuff out there in the public that are going to, damage our client's interest, damage the interests of the state. So that is something that's quite important. But, when you say 21st century technology, I think there have been a lot of improvements. And you want to talk a little bit about the process of even searching for those documents and exactly what we do at our office for that?
And again, we're speaking for the Department of Attorney General, which is one of 10,000 public bodies in Michigan subject to FOIA, with different budgets, with different experiences and expertise. The state has introduced a method by where every time we create a document, be it an email or legal pleading, we have, I think, 4 choices, confidential, internal, public, that need to be keyed onto that document. So that addresses what you're talking about, something in advance to assist. But even then, just because the creator or author of that document said it is confidential, doesn't mean the FOIA coordinator can rely on some title. The FOIA coordinator is still responsible in consultation maybe with others in the office as to whether that confidential statement would fit an exemption under the FOIA, which is a completely different consideration. So, and with that said too, is that because of the numbers, now again, the Attorney General is one of the smaller state departments, equally important but small in size. But if you look at the Department of State Police, you're talking upwards of 6,000 FOIA requests a year. The Department of Health and Human Services, upwards of 8,000 FOIA requests. And I'm giving you general numbers. I haven't looked statistically at it recently, but we're talking thousands of requests for thousands upon thousands of records. So again, it's not that easy to simply push a button. It's not that we only offer 3 models of documents that you can choose from, like purchasing a vehicle. What models are available to me. So it is very time consuming, but I do agree, particularly with local units of government, where there has to be some sort of data processing or data platforms that can be used to make it easier. This is happening. We are seeing introductions through our procurement office on different products that are being offered now to assist public bodies in processing FOIA requests more diligently, more efficiently, less expensive. So it is happening, but sometimes not fast enough for some of us. And it also depends on local units of government's budgets, of course. Again, that's a general response to your more specific question. I hope that helps somewhat.
So we're supposed to check a box before we send the emails then? Or maybe you guys should include me in on this when I started. But,
TMB just introduced it
oh, okay, great. When did that get introduced?
about 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago. Okay. Well, maybe in the future you're like, let me in on some of that stuff so that I have that information. Okay. Okay, fantastic. All right, sir.
My name is Salim Manan, and I'm from Saginaw, Michigan. Originally born in Detroit, so I've always been in the state. I was born in 1951, and I've been in the state for a long time. I'm here for one reason, and that is because I know the state can do better than what it's been doing in terms of being transparent. You were right in saying that Michigan, we're probably one of the least transparent governments in the whole country. And where there's smoke, there's fire. Why would you want to put in the government, hide what are you doing, unless you want to do something? You need to talk about what are the repercussions when you're not transparent. You know what they are? They're Benton Harbor, they're Flint, they're Saginaw, it's Detroit. Now, I'll go to, if you want to be, talking about being transparent, we play in the lottery in Saginaw, and it's supposed to go to the schools. But if you trace the money in Detroit, Saginaw was the 10 top, it made the most money in lottery. They were closing schools in Saginaw, but you couldn't get the information of where's the money we playing in lottery. You need to talk about that. You need to talk about the liquor licensing that the state does. And before Flint had the water crisis, they had a liquor problem. Liquor stores everywhere, but no grocery stores. The states was licensing that. Not even on gas stations to share this cheap liquor. How are we going to make it like that? So we need the information for gambling and all of that to come back to us so that we can rebuild our community the way that it should. Now this state can do better. I was under military, and we were completely open. But now what is happening? Now what is the payment for that? I'll tell you what the cost is. Michigan State University, all those girls. What happened? No transparency in our state. The water crisis in Flint. No transparency. Most of these people don't know what took place in Flint. But I know because I was there and I'm on the ground level. Benton Harbor, the only African-American school in that city, you want to close it. If it had not been for this governor, they would have closed that school.
Who's this you you're talking about, just out of curiosity?
So I'm saying that this is important that we be transparent, completely transparent. And nobody should be exempt. The Supreme Court,
Right.
the governor, no one.
Well, sir, I tell you what, I share your frustration. You're right. I agree with you. You have every right to be concerned about what your government is doing. I'm concerned about what the government is doing. And that's why I'm here today with all of you. I want to let you know about what you can do with FOIA and OMA, but I'm here also to talk about the limitations of it because we don't have actors in some critical offices that are promoting transparency. I'm here today to tell you that my office is as transparent as we possibly can be, and I'm committed to doing that for the rest of the time that I have in office. But of course, I don't control the legislature, and do I hope that they move forward and pass these laws that would create better transparency so that we would have the opportunity to know what was happening in the governor's office, and we would have the opportunity to know what our legislature was doing. But you know, I can only do as much as I can in my capacity as Michigan Attorney General, which is to make certain that my office is transparent, and to call for others to do the same.
Now, I'll say this in our close. The marijuana issue. We were told that they're going to lower the liquor license. The state is going to work with the different communities to lower the liquor license wherever my people are located, African Americans. And they admit that we were the ones who paid the cost for the marijuana law. We went to jail for it. So we're going to make the license cheaper so you can sell marijuana in our communities. Now, coming out of the woodwork, most of the people that's getting the licenses are white people. And they smoking dope, but they don't go to jail like you're sending my people to jail. There's nothing about making it out. But you can work with the state to lower the liquor license to put them in my community. The same way in Detroit, you got 2 liquor stores on every block selling cheap liquor to us.
Sir, there's a lot in our government,
It's the state doing that.
I understand, and there's a lot of things that we ought to know more about, and that is a big.
We can do better as a state.
This is the whole point of this presentation, is to talk about how we can do better as a state,
And
right?
We put women in office to do something about it.
Okay, there's nothing that you're saying that I'm disagreeing with. I am with you, sir. I believe in transparency. Again, the most that I can do right now is to go all around the state like I'm doing, talk about what the laws currently are, talk about how we should have better laws. And so that is what I'm committed to doing, and that's what I'm trying to do.
If politicians get their money, we should know. You understand? If they get money from wealthy people, because wherever you get your money from, that's who you serve. We should know if our politicians, wherever they get their money from, we should know.
I agree. I'm not a big fan of the super PAC laws. I do think that we should have those kinds of disclosures. I agree that we ought to know where political officials, how their campaigns are financed. I believe that campaign finance disclosures should be widely broadened. And I will tell you that I made a commitment during my campaign not to take any corporate PAC money because I did not want to be influenced by it, and I kept my promise. I did not. So I hear you and I understand, but that's why I'm out here trying to talk about these issues, because I agree with you. Let me do this. Just let's move on to the next portion of this, and then we're going to take some more questions, all right? And that is the third on our list of most commonly asked questions about exemptions, and that's, this involves actually when you can take an exemption, when you can't. So that's Section 13 of the FOIA statute, and it addresses its exemptions from disclosure for public body as a school district, intermediate school district, or public school academy, withholding of information required by law or in possession of an executive office. So there's 4 general categories for exemptions. First, records of a personal nature. So for example, we're not permitted to provide private or confidential information or embarrassing or intimate details of a person's life where there might be harm or threat or endangerment from the public disclosure. So things that we would cite, somebody's social security number, you're not entitled to that. The case is something that I complained about a lot when I was an assistant prosecutor for Wayne County. The Republicans decided to FOIA my personnel records from Wayne County, and not only did they give them my social security number, but I took a leave of absence from complications from when I was pregnant, and I had to submit my medical records to the office in order to get that leave of absence right to the Republicans. So, that's the kind of thing you can understand. Like, there's a lot that you should be able to know about your public officials, but information about complications from their pregnancy probably is not something they're entitled to. Also, records that would impair the safety or security of a public institution or the safe and efficient operation of police or military authority. So, for example, let's say you had a prisoner who FOIA'd the blueprints for the prison in which they were being held. That's the kind of thing you probably are not going to give out, to see where the best Shawshank Redemption tunnel should be in the prison. That's an exemption. Records exempted based on public policy. And again, not just attorney-client privilege, doctor-patient confidentiality. That would be exempted. Records exempt by other statutes, either state or federal. And as Tom mentioned, HIPAA, for example, a person's medical information is protected by HIPAA, and that supersedes the FOIA statute. And again, the kind of statutes or kind of exemptions that we have to take in our office, such as, for instance, if we have an ongoing investigation, let's say there's a criminal matter and we are investigating that matter and we're the middle of that investigation, well, we're not going to release that. And we're certainly not going to say to somebody that we're investigating for having committed a murder, like, hey, we're on to you, man. Just thought you should know. That's the kind of thing that we are exempted by until that investigation has been completed. And again, attorney-client privilege is something that we, take very seriously as important, as well as when we have ongoing litigation and its work product during the course of that litigation. So one of those common questions that we receive about these exemptions involves personal information. And that's, obviously very important because there are instances where requests contain very personal information about people. And again, we can't jeopardize a person's safety or well-being. And one of the things that we, are really concerned about in my office, of course, involves identity theft. We deal with those issues all the time, so we can't provide the type of information that would subject a person to identity theft crimes. So what we do is we redact that information, but what we try hard to do is redact using a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer. And so there's a two-pronged test that we use to see whether or not that information is exempt. Firstly, the information has to be of a personal nature. And then secondly, that disclosure would constitute, here's the phrase, a clearly unwarranted invasion of an individual's privacy. And so there's a very famous and recent case on this, ESPN v. Michigan State University. And it was determined that if the material sheds light on whether the public body is functioning properly and consistently with the statutory and constitutional mandates, then it is not a clearly unwarranted invasion of an individual's privacy and thus not exempt from disclosure. I will say, speaking of Michigan State University, when you talk about attorney-client privilege, as you know, our office did a very comprehensive review of events leading up to the Nassar case. And even though Michigan State University Board of Trustees had specifically requested that the Department of Attorney General conduct a thorough and comprehensive investigation, they then proceeded to refuse to turn over, it was really over 7,000 emails to the AG's office so they could complete that investigation. And they claimed attorney-client privilege for that. And when it went to court, the judge on the case upheld that over 6,000 of those emails did fall into attorney-client privilege, which again, that is their right, but also don't ask the AG to do an investigation into see what happened at MSU on the Nassar case, but then claim these exemptions and not turn over the necessary information to complete that investigation. That's my point on that. So does anybody at this point, given what we just talked about, have any more questions about exemptions or anything? Yes, sir. I'm sorry I'm not getting you in the back. I can't see you as well. So just, if you have a question after this gentleman's question, just stand up so I can see you.
No, thank you for being here. What I have is a specific question with regard to the application of the FIOA statute with regard to gerrymandering. Although the legislature itself is exempt, what about commissions, agencies, companies, consultants that drew the lines? And can that information be asked for? And how far down the chain does this exemption go?
Well, as you might know, of course, there was a federal lawsuit that involved that. And even though there was information that could not be FOIA'd in terms of legislative emails, it sure was subpoenaed. And I think for those of you who followed that case, there were some very interesting things in those emails that were obtained by attorneys who were plaintiffs in that case. But clearly, under the law as it is, the public couldn't just simply FOIA that information to learn about that. In regard to anybody else that had contact with them, what are your thoughts on that, Tom? Because, obviously, if these are emails that are back and forth from the legislature, first of all, if it's a private company or something, you can't FOIA them, obviously. They're not subject to FOIA. But are there any other potential parties that could have been FOIA'd under those circumstances?
Likely not in that factual situation that you presented. Something akin, not to get off your subject totally, but if a public body pays with taxpayer dollars, obviously, the services of another entity, a private company, the public body that is FOIA'd for records that happen to be in the physical possession of that company holding those records because of taxpayer dollars paid to it, the public body can't say they're not ours, it's with that company. That they still constructively possess those. So where you have retained the services of an outside entity that itself would not be subject to FOIA, the records they hold based on that contract with the public body can be reached through the FOIA. Another example, I'm alluding to certain cases, in fact, so without giving you case names, it's not law class, and you are all yeah, and you're smart enough that you decided not to go. I appreciate that. But where you have, in this one case, a school district hired an attorney to do an investigation, and the attorney was paid with taxpayer dollars to turn over an investigative report, no matter if it's with the attorney or now with the public body school district, that's subject to FOIA. They said the attorney's notes, the stuff that he or she put together to prepare the report, weren't reachable under FOIA. So the court looks at every case specifically as to those facts. It's a case-by-case analysis. As to your question on the gerrymandering, again, unless there were taxpayer dollars involved by a public body that itself is subject to FOIA, and records were being held by the outside entity, unless we have that factual arrangement, then there would not be a FOIA reach, if you will. But as the Attorney General mentioned, FOIA is just one avenue of access. You've heard of subpoenas. In a lawsuit between X versus Y, there's things called requests for production of documents as part of discovery. There's interrogatories. There's you've heard all these terms. So in other words, FOIA is the wide open gate, most popularly known way of accessing public records. It's not the only way. But unless you're a party to the lawsuit, you're probably not going to be having a subpoena issued on your behalf. Okay.
Okay, let me do this. Let me just move on to OMA really quick, and then I'll get back to you, but I just want to make sure that we don't miss out on the opportunity to talk a little bit about OMA, which of course is the Open Meetings Act, which doesn't always get the spotlight the way that FOIA does, but it's equally as important. And so this is literally about opening the doors to an open government. And so, like FOIA, OMA promotes governmental accountability, and it fosters openness in government to enhance responsible decision-making, and it requires certain meetings of certain public bodies that they be open to the public. Now, these meetings are required to have notice given, and a meeting actually cannot be held unless public notice is given and that it's consistent with the Open Meetings Act. So for our office, one of the top questions that we receive about that is related to closed sessions and special meetings. So closed sessions are permissible to have a discussion, but only for a few permitted purposes. So for instance, dismissal or disciplinary action of personnel or students, trial or settlement strategy, if there's litigation pending, application for employment to a public office if the candidate requests that the application remain confidential. However, their interview has to actually be held in an open meeting. And then there are some others. So as outlined in Section 7 of the OMA statute, you have to have, and here's some examples, you have to have a 2/3 roll call vote of members elected or appointed and serving, which is required to call a closed session, except for closed sessions permitted under Sections 8A, B, C, G, I, and J. And the roll call vote and the purpose or purposes for closing the session shall be entered into the minutes of the meeting at which that vote is taken. And then a separate set of minutes shall be taken by the clerk or the designated secretary of the public body at the closed session. And those minutes shall be retained by the clerk of the public body, are not available to the public, and shall only be disclosed if required by a civil action filed under sections 10, 11, or 13. So these minutes may be destroyed 1 year and 1 day after the approval of the minutes of the regular meetings at which the closed session was approved. I know that's a lot. But what I would say is that, I'd strongly caution any of these public bodies against trying to skirt the Open Meetings Act by having, say, a few of the people sit in the hallway outside an open door, which sometimes actually happens. And our philosophy is, look, man, you signed up for this, right? So you have to be prepared to have some very difficult discussions in full view of the public if you want to sit on that body. Just goes with the territory. And that discussions and debates should not be held behind closed doors, away from the public. And then there are penalties for OMA violations. So a public official who intentionally violates the act may be found guilty of a misdemeanor and may be personally liable for actual and exemplary damages of not more than $500 per meeting. So, FOIA and OMA, obviously, they shape our government, and they ensure, when they're utilized properly, that the government stays accountable to the people. And as I've indicated multiple times, I think that we each have a responsibility and an obligation to ensure that the public is well informed about what's happening within our offices and within the government. And so sunshine is important in the work we do. Again, keeps us accountable, and a well-informed society can better contribute to the democratic process. I think we all agree in that. So I'm going to cut it off at that. Courtney, do we have time for some more questions? A few more? Okay, let's take a few more questions. And there was somebody over here that I felt bad that I didn't get to call on who was raising their hand. Well, why don't we go ahead, sir, with you in the back.
I was just wondering about the Supreme Court. Did you say there's an exemption to freedom of information to the Supreme Court? Is that true, or did I misunderstand what you said?
Nope, that's true.
Why? That's not right.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the act,
That's
so.
bad. Why do they do that? Why is it?
What's that?
Why are they
Do you,
doing that?
why don't you go ahead and address how that came about?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is why is the judicial branch of our state government not subject to FOIA? And the reason for that is the legislature back in 1976, when they wrote the statute, excluded the judicial branch of government, which is Supreme Court, all your circuit courts, etc. Remember, however, that there are Michigan court rules, and the court rules set forth how we as citizens can access the records of the court at the court clerk's office. So there's another avenue of access called the court rules. In 1996, I think it was, the Supreme Court brought itself into a FOIA-like arrangement where it issued an administrative order saying that certain records would be available to the public. That's not within FOIA, though, and that's your question. Why are they outside FOIA? Because the legislature, in the initial language, excluded them from FOIA. So that's a matter of legislative fix, if there is to be one.
Does that provide information on the Supreme Court for that avenue? That kind of you just talked about?
I'm sorry, the question is, how do we make the court subject to FOIA?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of let's see, Elizabeth Weaver, I know she's not in court anymore, she has passed, but she was really big on transparency in the court up there before she stepped down. And I was just wondering about it.
Well, again, the mechanism to access court records is through the Michigan court rules. Okay, so it's a different construct than FOIA.
So you can find information through that way.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for your question, for clarification.
You're welcome.
Okay, and I think I'm going to have time for one more question. So, all right, sir, you want to go ahead? Please. And I apologize to everybody whose questions I didn't get to. Oh, and Tom can stay behind, by the way. So if anybody has specific questions and they want those answered, he'll stay and he'll answer your questions, and he'll be here till midnight because that's how dedicated he is, right? Right. Okay, so go ahead, sir.
My name is Brad Eddy. I grew up in this town in Midland here, in Bay County. Recently, in 2015, I asked for a FOIA for purchasing my family's property at Collin Township. When I FOIA'd, some people came in and harassed me for the information I was getting. It was withheld. I probably have over $100,000 in legal fees on this. Now, when it comes down to the FOIAs, I have $700 in FOIAs waiting right now with the MDEQ and the Township of Collin, County of Bay. These FOIAs are out to hurt me and stop me from getting this information. Upon asking the township for this information, I found out there was nepotism in the township. One of the people who the township supervisor was related to was a contractor that dumped a lot of materials in the wetlands. Well, it was dirty material from a chemical company in Bay County. When I found this information, I went to the DEQ. I received some information from the DEQ, and there's a phone number. Ms. Nessel, this disturbs me. I called this phone number. This person told me about what is being dumped in those wetlands, what is being dumped in the floodplain, what is subject to going to our rivers and out to our bay. This person's life was threatened. I have a copy of it, the voice recording of this person whose phone number, the DEQ, violated their rights. He was threatened his life, okay, by the contractor he works for because he knew too much. With saying that, this has cost me and my wife, my family, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of time. 2 weeks ago, I got to Collin Township after this supervisor was recalled. Once he was recalled, the new supervisor let me into this room called the vault in the township. Everything was in there pertaining to my family's property. He filed lawsuits against my family, Ms. Nessel. He ruined relationships with my family. This person is a very evil person. When it come down to the DEQ getting information from them, I kept FOIAing. I kept FOIAing the township. I FOIA'd the County Road Commission, the County Drain Commission. Do they have information on this person? Any of this information was funny. I showed documents from, correspondences with all these people together. You FOIA them, nothing. You FOIA this one, something. You FOIA this one, there's emails. The connections are there. But the corruption is there too. The Bay County Historical Society takes a millage for information. Well, the Township of Collin and the County of Bay store records there with this millage. I FOIA'd that department, the Bay County Historical Society, because there were property information. When I FOIA'd that, they said that they were exempt to it. I went into a meeting there. They told me to never come again. Well, my family's attorney subpoenaed that information, $990. Okay? With saying that, that was our information to begin with. And what you just said to him said that information is ours because we pay for the historical preservation. It don't mean we shouldn't be able to get it. It shouldn't be exempt. Now, subpoenaing it would have changed a court case. It would have changed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of both sides litigating. But the thing is there's millions of dollars worth of cleanup they're covering up. That upsets me. Now, that was the previous administration from 2008. So your administration came, I think some major cleanup needs to happen in Bay County, and the amount of dirt that I got, it's a dump truck full. I want to clean it up. I'm asking you to take this voice recording, and I'm asking you to really listen to the threats made to me, my family, and the person at the DEQ give me the phone number.
Okay. So, sir, let me say this, and I'm sorry, that was, obviously this has been a very lengthy process for you. And
Over here talking about the Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau passed that legislation, I believe, due to what's going on with me. I don't have no natural drainage. These people are involved with the Farm Bureau Association.
well, lucky for you, I didn't get any money from the Farm Bureau. So that means, I am more than happy to take a look at any information that you have, and especially if I can switch gears away from FOIA and just get into the environmental pollutants, which was the thing that you were concerned about in the first place that led to all these FOIA requests.
FOIA request stopped a sale of property, which
Right.
put me and my family in a predicament where we were selling our house to move to this new location. This person threatened that we wouldn't be able, they were going to put an injunction against us. Well, the township supervisor put an injunction against us with the township's money, with the government's money, not with the private individual's money who stole the property from my family. I mean, it's
Right.
wrong.
So why don't we do this as to this particular situation is if Tom, could you talk to this gentleman and get the information that he's talking about? And Courtney from my office is here too, and she can take your information. And this is something that I would be happy to have our department take a look at and see if we can figure out what happened and see what we can figure out in terms of moving forward.
I care, Dana, that you make sure that 32 years of the same stuff don't keep going. I want to make sure that somebody with some fresh knowledge and stuff gets a hold of this. Please don't let it go to him and not get to you.
Okay, I understand, and I can understand your frustration too, and obviously this has been years and years of difficulties.
Bill Schuette don't help.
Well, Bill Schuette is not the Michigan Attorney General anymore, I am. So that being the case, please, sir, pass your information on to Tom or Courtney or anybody in my staff who's going to remain here, and I promise you that we will look into it. Leave your contact information as well, please. Fantastic. Well, I would love to stay here longer. I'm sorry, but I'm on a schedule and I got to head to my next event. But I want to say thank you so much to everybody for coming today and being here and discussing this important topic. Thank you guys. I've done dozens and dozens of town halls on all kinds of subject matter, not just FOIA, on clean water issues, on elder abuse, we have a new payroll fraud task force, and we're taking that around the state to find out about workers who have been denied their proper pay or they've been misclassified. So we have a number of town halls going at the same time. I promise you, Midland, I'm going to be back here, and I'll be back here soon. But you can also see me all around the state. I'm going to try to make every day of the time that I have in office count and do everything we can to rectify some of these concerns that you have, sir, and that many of you have, and to work our hardest to make certain that the Department of Attorney General is not just the most transparent government entity in the state, but the most responsive to the concerns of our state residents. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I'll be back soon. Thanks so much. And come and talk to Tom if you have any additional questions or concerns.